as you love, you will see me in the stars. As you look up at the stars, I will be there.
I'm Monica Charette, and this is Holding the Light.
As long as you love, I will whisper in your ear. Little whispers you will hear. As long as you love.
The holidays are at our doorstep, and for those who are grieving the loss of a child, or anyone, or anything for that matter, this is an especially challenging time. Colby and I were honored to catch up with Mark Joes. He's a professional grief counselor, hospice volunteer, and an amazing grief support group facilitator. In this episode, Mark helps shatter the myths and shares suggestions for surviving the holiday season. He talks about the 3 C's when approaching this time of year, and the greatest lesson he has learned of just how strong and powerful grief really is. We hope something you hear helps you or the grieving heart of someone you love. Today, we are grateful to hold the light with Mark Joes. Hello to our listeners, and thank you for continuing to follow our podcast. We have cleared our schedule this week to talk about something very timely and important to grieving families. It's the question on many hearts and minds of people who are missing someone right now. How are we ever going to get through the holidays? And if you are a friend of someone who is grieving, you might be asking, how can I help? So we are honored today to have with us a very special guest, Mark Joes. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
So we are recording this episode in early November. We've already survived Halloween, which for many of us is also challenging. We don't want to discount that. But now we are entering the season of gratefulness, family gatherings, joyful music, a time of boundless hope and happiness, and which is all very polar opposite of how many of us are actually feeling. So before we jump in, Mark, if you could tell us about the important role you serve in grief support and the experience you bring to our conversation today.
Thank you, Monica and Colby. It's a privilege to be here. I am a social worker, and I've worked in hospice. I'm retired now, but for almost 25 years. And for the last decade of that, I have done just bereavement support work, working with families and caregivers after someone has died in their family. I also am a hospice volunteer, and for a decade or so have done a group every year called Grief Through the Holidays, which is an open group for anybody who's had a loss and needs some support through the holidays. That's the experience I bring. I've had a number of losses in my family, parents, brothers, sisters, suicide, but I have not had a child loss, and I have not had a partner loss. But I have talked to hundreds of people who have had those losses, and they are my teachers. And I learn something new every time I am present to someone in their grieving process, and I'll be learning today.
Great. So an important clarification maybe you might want to provide is that the peer support group is not a therapy group, correct?
That's correct.
So much of the support really comes from the participants, right, and what they offer each other.
That's right. Some of the facilitators have had some counseling experience. Other volunteers have just gone through the training to facilitate groups, and the facilitators do just that. They help make the group a safe place to talk. Most of the learning and sharing goes between the participants themselves.
It's a great resource, I think, and most communities have them throughout, no matter where you live, across the country, or the world for that matter. What are they like? Because I have to admit, I have not been to a grief support group. What are they like? How many people are in them, and what does it feel like to be in a support group like that?
The groups are usually between 3 to 8 or 9 people, and they can vary in their format. Some groups do a lot of activities, We usually start off any group with people sharing their story and then talking about where they are in their grief process now and the challenges they're facing, and we learn from each other.
What would you say is the most common thread in your support groups and leading the support groups? What do people share most often is the most difficult thing for them during the holidays?
I think a lot of it is about expectations,
Hmm.
and both expectations from what the holidays are supposed to be and have been in our lives, but also expectations from others about what you should or should not be doing.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys, I've listened to some of your podcasts, and you ask such wonderful, supportive questions. But if it's okay, I'd like to turn the tables just for a short time, because I think if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of your experience with the holidays, I think that will provide many avenues for us to talk about the issues that exist. And I'm thinking about when Cassidy died on October 11th, and the holidays were quickly on the heels of that. What was that like for both of you that first year, Thanksgiving and Christmas?
Yeah, the grief season for us is difficult because of when it began in October, and Halloween came right on the heels of her passing. I remember people in our house at Halloween, neighbors, laughter. I was thinking, what are they smiling about? What are they smiling at all? I couldn't comprehend. Of course, you're in a deep fog too at that point in grief.
Yeah,
Not denial, just confusion for me. Those first few weeks, and then Thanksgiving came so quickly after that. You're just not prepared for how you're going to feel and how other people are going to react towards you. That first Thanksgiving, we traveled to my mom's house in Aroostook County, and Colby and Randy, my husband, came with me. I just remember that day being so difficult because no one knew what to say to us, and we didn't know how to express our feelings. I spent almost most of the day on Thanksgiving in a room by myself. And I remember Randy and Colby going to my in laws for dinner that day too. I remember that Colby and I just couldn't go. I just couldn't go. I couldn't face anyone. What were your feelings during that time, Colby?
I was actually having some trouble remembering what we did for Thanksgiving. For Halloween, I don't know. There was a few things at that time. I would say for most of the holidays, I was sort of like happily occupied or busy all the time. That first Halloween, in the same sense that there were so many people in our house, there was also a lot of kids. We were all kind of congregating in the basement, some old friends and stuff. And there's no like how-to book for like a child experiencing grief or like a teenager at that time. So I definitely was worried about sort of my outward appearance and how I looked. So I just tried my best to have fun with my friends and kind of goof around. Thanksgiving definitely more difficult, but like I said, I think I might have blocked that one out. I wasn't sure if we had stayed home or gone to family, but I definitely remember the first Christmas, and that was very strange. But it was helpful, obviously, to be around family that whole time, to have my support system around me.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about that is the difference because he was trying to feel normal, and I was desperately following his lead, trying to figure out what's best for Colby. That was really my focus. Christmas was very difficult that year, and I'm sure you remember it, Colby, because we all the traditions that you normally have as a family suddenly don't feel right. And we were trying to find out how to get through that first Christmas. We were here. My mom joined us. I remember saying to Colby again, trying to follow his lead, "Would you like a Christmas tree?" And yes, yes, of course we'll get a Christmas tree. And we went and got one, and it made its way into the house. We decorated it with blue lights in honor of Cassidy because that was her favorite color. And that is as far as it got. Right, Colby? Because we remember we talked about, okay, well, let's go get the ornaments. And we are a very traditional family of saving all the ornaments the children had made over the years, and each had a special meaning to them. And I remember Colby going down over the stairs to get the box and turning around, coming back, and just saying, I can't do it.
Yeah, that was a very quiet Christmas.
Mm. We did put out stockings. I remember that, and made sure we still had Cassidy's stocking out, and we had gifts for Cassidy, as small as they were. And we just kind of muddled through the day. Do you remember me doing that scavenger hunt for you, Colby? I don't know what I was even thinking. I don't even remember doing it, but trying to make it fun for you that morning.
Yeah, I do remember that. Yeah.
I think I just wanted to make it okay for him, but I also wanted it just to be over with. I think everybody just wanted it to be over. I don't imagine you felt that way, Colby, because you were still 15 and wanted to have some of the traditions, but it's really hard to have your traditions without your whole family there.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I was trying to usher the day along in any sense, but it was just so odd and strange. It was almost like I was kind of watching it from a a third party perspective, just how different the house felt. Obviously, like you said, the absence of so many traditions, and usually at the end of the day on Christmas, it was sort of common to that some of the families in the neighborhood would start kind of house hopping, and families would all meet up, and that didn't happen that year. It was just it was very quiet, surreal almost.
Yeah, it's difficult for your friends and family to know what to do too.
What you're sharing is so much of what I hear from families who have lost someone, especially in the few months right before the holidays. Those first holidays are often about survival and just getting through them.
Yeah, there's a lot of disbelief that happens,
Mhm.
a lot of crying, but just a lot of disbelief. I remember the music, the Christmas music that I so cherished and loved, was so loud and so disruptive to my days that I shut them down. I wouldn't allow anybody to have Christmas music in my house or in my car. It was just too hard for me. Again, just trying to get through it, get through the holiday.
And often people do need alone time and need to be to themselves in order to get through it. And sometimes it's hard for families to accept that or allow it.
Right. Year two felt more like reality. I wondered if you do you hear that a lot from families, like the second year sometimes can be even harder.
Yes.
I think you're kind of just waking up from everything and realizing that yes, this is forever.
There's a saying, sometimes it is hard for the heart to accept what the mind already knows.
That's actually a really good way of putting that. That's so true.
Many people report that on at least in the second year, people begin to be able to do some kind of planning for the holiday, to figure out how they're going to handle the holiday, to make some choices about what they're going to do, what they're not going to do, if any special things they want to do to honor the person that has been lost, to honor Cassidy. Did you do anything that second year?
Actually, the first Christmas, I neglected to mention this, the very first Christmas, we went to the Humane Society and our neighbors joined us. And we had a focus of taking care of the animals that our children loved as volunteers there, supporting the staff there. They opened it up for us, which was really special. They had to bring some people in to allow us to come in for the morning, but it was just the morning. So we wanted to make sure that other families could honor their own traditions. But then we had to come home and face ours. And that's the piece that I remember so much was it was so nice to be around people, as sad as it was. It was hard, but we were just really grateful to have them with us. And in subsequent years now, I think I hyper plan our holidays now. October comes and I'm already asking Colby, what do you think? Where are we going? We'd never wanted to be in our home again. It was so hard that first year that we started thinking about how can we make our traditions just a little different so they're not so painful. And we were so fortunate that we had friends that offered their vacant homes in different places the first several years of Christmas. And we would bring my mom, and Colby had this wonderful friend and whose family allowed him to leave their Christmas traditions to be with us. Do you want to mention that, Colby? Because that was really amazing.
I mean, I think you summarized it pretty well, but it was really special because, like I said, for a long time during those holidays, I was happily distracted, and that's a family made a sacrifice of their own in order for things to be a little easier for me, and it was really special. I cherish a lot of those Christmases spent with my friend. It was great.
Yeah, that was pretty special. And we had some neighborhood friends who would travel to where we were that Christmas. We might be up in the mountains so that Colby could ski or wherever we were, and they would spend the holiday with their families, and then they would drive and be with us for dinner. So that was really really helpful because you want to be alone, but once you're alone, you really don't want to be by yourselves the entire holiday. Interestingly, though, here we are 8 years later. We're still not doing Christmas at our home. We still don't have a tree up in our home at Christmas, and that's okay. And we've both said, until we get to a point where we want that every year that we don't have it, we give ourselves some grace and say, this is what we need for our family. Well, last year, I think it was, Colby, I said to you, as I often do, what would help you through the holiday? And for the first time, you said, could we have a little light in our house? Like it's kind of dark during the holidays. Could I have a little light? So I did go out and get some lights that I just put up in our general family spaces. And I remember decorating your space where you were on your computer with your friends and just to bring a little light into your life. But as I said, it's what we do and it's not what everybody can do. I recognize that.
Yes.
What about children, Mark, who are grieving during the holidays? I mean, how can we best support them? How do you share that with families?
I think that's a challenge because everybody's grieving and everybody's off balance, and you're just trying to keep your feet under you, and it's hard to figure out how to help. I think the most important thing is to talk and to talk and to cry together and to talk.
Hmm.
Dale Clark, who was one of the directors of the Waterville Hospice program, had a story. Her husband died in the fall before Christmas, and she couldn't face Christmas or doing anything with the tree. And she had a son who I think was about 6 years old. And she told this story in public, so I know I can tell it. One day she looked out the kitchen window and he had gotten a saw out of the garage and had cut down a Christmas tree. And it was a little Charlie Brown Christmas tree, and he was dragging it across the lawn. And she realized at that moment that she had to consider her son, and that there was someone, even though she had lost someone so precious to her, there was also someone in her life who was also precious to her that she needed to be present to. So they brought the tree in and they set it up, and she couldn't face getting out any of the traditional ornaments. So they spent the next few days making handmade ornaments for the tree. And she said that Christmas had a lot of precious memories, even though it was also very sad.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's pretty special. I guess what you have to tell people too is you be prepared for unwelcome responses from kids. You just don't know how they're going to react during the holidays. I'm sure they're angry sometimes, they're sad, confused, like the rest of us.
Yes. The great thing about kids is they're often more open, and you know what they're feeling, even if they don't know why.
So true.
I like that.
I do too. And they crave routine,
Mhm.
so you try to keep their routine as normal as you can. I'm curious to know what you have learned from grieving families, anything that kind of shattered your conception of what grief is. Because I certainly have learned a lot. I know Colby has. Do you learn from other people? Is there something that you thought after doing this for so many years is really something that's eye opening?
I guess the main thing that's eye-opening is just how strong and powerful grief is and how long it lasts. One of my first experiences in really understanding grief was early in my hospice career, and this is a child loss story. I was working with a woman who was in her 80s, and she was on hospice. A wonderful woman, really fun to visit, and great sense of humor. And she was talking, she had a wonderful family, 3 daughters who were there all the time. And she mentioned a couple of times that she had 4 children, but there were only 3 daughters around. So one day I asked her about it, and she told me that she had a son, and when he was 12 years old, he went out sled riding, and he slid down the driveway into the street and was killed by a car.
Oh my gosh, that's horrible.
And when she told me that story, her grief was right there, and her tears were right there. And it had been like a good 50 years since that had happened. And that's when I realized that grief never goes away, that it's something that you hold in your heart for the rest of your life. It's a part of your life. And it's as it should be if you love someone as deeply as you love a child or a sister or
Hmm.
name the family member. There's this poster at the Grieving Children's program that says, "We grieve as deeply as we love." And, if you love someone that much, how could you ever forget that and forget the loss? And that sounds like it could be depressing, but I also realized this woman led a wonderful life. She was very active in the community. She was very active in her church. She had, as I said, she was witty. She was fun. She was joyful. And so she was able to carry this loss and find a way to carry it in a way where she could still enjoy her life, but still hold the love for her son. That's the biggest thing I think I've learned about grief.
Well, there are a lot of myths, and we've talked about that. We want to share the what do we call it? Shattering the 8 myths about holiday grief. So we're kind of adapting that from hospice, but we wanted to put a spin on it around child loss. But this could be applied to anyone who's grieving. So I'll bring the myth out, and maybe Mark, you could talk a little bit about what you think the reality is, and Colby, you can as well. So here we go. The first myth is that we are only grieving deaths during the holidays.
Yes, deaths are probably the biggest place we experience grief. I had, over my time in hospice, just happens 2 nurses that I work with had their houses burned to the ground.
Hmm.
And no one fortunately was hurt, but that's a kind of grief. Losing a job, divorce. When someone dies, at least usually we can trust that they loved us and we loved them, but divorce doesn't often end that way.
Right.
So many, many kinds, and also not only people, but dogs, cats.
Exactly.
Those are all the kinds of losses that we grieve.
All right, then. Myth number 2 is only family members really grieve during the holidays.
And whoever loves somebody grieves somebody.
Right. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, your child's friends. That's something that we've learned so important. We need to be there to support them.
Yeah.
Another myth is grief isn't an emotional reaction.
And I'd say it's primarily that. But, grief affects us physically as well, both in how we feel it. You tend to feel grief as a physical experience. It's often that tightening in the pit of the stomach and the churning and the anxiety and sleeplessness and many physical manifestations that come with it. And it also ripples through all of our social contacts and affects our social world as well.
What about the myth that individuals should grieve privately?
I think the more you can share and the more you can talk about grief, the better. But you have to pick and choose where you can do that because it's not always a positive experience, depending on where you share it. Alan Wolfelt, who's a longtime grief counselor, he has what he called the rule of thirds, and I don't know if it's the thirds, but I think it's pretty close. Where he said a third of the people that you spend time with, he said, when you're done talking to them, you feel worse, and you should avoid those people if at all possible. And he said about a third of the people, it doesn't change things very much. And it's okay to be around those people, and maybe they'll provide a distraction. But he said a third of the people you talk to or spend time with, and you'll feel a little bit better. And those are the people you should seek out, and those are the people you should invite into your close circle of friends during your grieving time. And I think that's pretty true.
I've also learned that it's such a privilege when someone shares their grief with me, even when I'm grieving.
Yes.
So another myth is in time, we will recover from our grief. I think you started to address that earlier.
Yes. Also, this idea that it's a straight line, at the end of a year or two, you're all done grieving, and when in fact it's such a roller coaster, and and it's always 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, and you can think that you're making good progress, and you've got your grief in hand, and then you find yourself crying in the cereal aisle in the supermarket because you saw someone's favorite cereal, wherever that trigger happened.
Absolutely. This myth is grief means letting go. What does that mean to you?
It just, it doesn't happen. We stay connected all our lives, just like we stay connected to all of the people we love the most in our lives.
Yeah, I really believe it's a different relationship that you have with the person that you lost, never fully detaching from them.
And I think the process has to do, someone talked about it being like a rough stone in a riverbed, that you work your grief and work your grief until you sort of wear off the jagged edges, and becomes a little more comfortable to carry.
It's a really good analogy. Okay, myth number 7 is that grief will end eventually.
And it does change, and balance changes, but it's slow and it's subtle. Someone said, I promise you that the time will come when a smile will come to your lips before a tear comes to your eye. And it does change like that. Our grief is a mixture of all of the feelings, including joy. The balance slowly changes, and it becomes less painful less often for most people. But there are still times years later when something comes along, something opens up, and you find yourself reduced to tears again.
And what about the myth that grievers are best left alone? I have to say, sometimes that's true. I just want to preface that first to say sometimes that is so true.
And that's a hard part. And I think those of us who are grieving, we have a responsibility to educate the people around us as to what we need. When you can figure that out, one of the hard parts in life, not just in grieving, is figuring out what we want. It's easier to figure out what we don't want often.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're grieving, it's important to let people know, as you were mentioning, children, especially children. Mommy's sad, daddy's sad right now, but I'll be okay. So they don't think you're going to disappear or something bad's going to happen. And educating friends, I want you to call. There may be a time when you call and I'll say, I'm not ready to talk, but that doesn't mean I don't want you to call again. Helping people to understand what it is that we need, but we all need those contacts and those chances to talk. It's a big part of what helps us through. I do some teaching. I even did a service at the church about grieving, and the biggest excuse I always hear people say is, I didn't want to mention the death because I didn't want to make them sad. And I know you mentioned this at one point, Monica, in one of your other podcasts. And I always say, I've got a secret to tell you. They're already sad.
Can't make us any sadder.
So it's okay to go there. And you have to trust that if people are not ready to talk, they'll tell you. But most of the time, people will appreciate and that you are willing to talk.
Well, and you want the opportunity to share your memories too, especially parents of child loss, is you want them to say their name. You want them to share their memories of your child. You know, just like when people ask me, hey, how's Colby doing? And I have all the pride of sharing everything about him. When you don't ask me, how would Cassidy have felt about this? Or, you know, where do you think she'd be today? Or I thought of something the other day that reminded me of her. That's still keeping her present. And that's really important, I think, for parents.
Yeah. I just remember a woman telling me she had lost her husband. Nobody will say his name.
Yeah.
I said his name countless times every day, and other people would ask me about him all the time. And now that he's died, nobody will say his name. They'll ask me how I'm doing, or how are things going. And I want to hear his name. I want to talk about him.
This gives me an opportunity to bring something up really quickly. If you're in our community over Christmas in December, we hold a blue Christmas ceremony in Oakland, Maine. It's a Shine on Cast gathering, but we started it last year on the winter solstice to remember those we have lost and to acknowledge that the holiday season is so difficult for so many people. So this year's event is on Wednesday, December 21st, again in Oakland, and we will say the names of your loved one. If you go to our website, shineoncast.org, and include your loved one's name, it doesn't have to be a child loss. It could be any loss this season. And we gather as a community and we say their names out loud. and share in our grief. So I wanted to include that, and I'll also include it in the show notes.
I'm so glad you're doing that because 5, 10 years ago, there were a few Blue Christmas services around in the communities and they've kind of disappeared and they're hard to find now. So I'm so glad that, and last year I was so glad to see you were doing that Blue Christmas service, and the solstice is a great time to do it.
Yeah, it's our honor to do that with our community. So let's do some tips and suggestions for surviving the holidays. Maybe we can each of us can think of one or two things that we want to share. There are many.
Yeah.
And some may speak to our listeners and others may just land flat, so that's okay. So I'll start. I want to something that I think is so important that I want to share is just to surround yourself with people who will let you talk about your child or the person you've lost, share in your loss. And the other thing is to recognize that these people might not be your relatives. That was a shocking thing for me, but it's really important for newly bereaved to understand that because they're grieving too.
Yeah. This is true in hospice and in bereavement. Sometimes people that you expect are going to show up don't show up. But fortunately, it's usually balanced by people who you don't expect to be there for you, who are suddenly there and a welcome surprise.
Yeah. What other suggestions do we have?
One of the things that we talk about in the groups that I do is I've seen it as 3 C's, 5 C's, but when you're approaching the holiday, 3 C's are to choose, to communicate, and to compromise. So the first part is the hardest, but it's to figure out what you want to do and to choose to do that. There are lots of family gatherings around, but you really want to be alone, then choose to do that. But then you have to communicate to family. You have to communicate that that's what you want. You have to communicate that you'll be okay because sometimes family thinks it's not right or safe for you to be alone. And then sometimes you have to compromise. If it's really important to a family that you be at a gathering, then it might be important that you go, but you might say, I'll come, but only for an hour. I also tell people always have an out, drive yourself. Don't go with someone where you have to depend on them to get you out of there if you need to go out. Or, ask your family where you can go in the house to be alone if you need a break.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice. I mentioned this before, but the whole planning ahead thing. I think the holidays are coming right now, whether you want them to or not. And sometimes just the anticipation, I think, of them is sometimes far worse than the actual day, I have learned. But take time to at least think about what the day might look like ahead and plan for it when you can.
There's an old Maine saying that anything dreaded is already half done.
Some great ones from you today. I love it.
I think too always that around any holiday season, it's really easy to sort of get into your own traditions and sort of like recognize the change that you're experiencing in your own life and focus on that. And that there's always opportunities that you can serve others. And if that is something that brings you pleasure or joy or gives you a sense of purpose, then that's something you can plan towards and commit to and do that can maybe help take your mind off things or just bring a little light into somebody else's day.
Yeah.
Yeah, along those same lines too, some people make donations on Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever celebration it might be in memory of their loved one, and we have found that to be healing in many ways.
Yeah. Along those lines, Monica, but Colby, yes, there's all these holiday dinner at Messalonsky that they have at Thanksgiving, where you can go work or go deliver, and Christmas at the Elks. You already mentioned the Humane Society, the shelter. Those are ways you can do things. I know a family every year in memory of their mother, they put together the 5 sisters 5 Thanksgiving baskets for families in her name, and that's a way of remembering her.
Yeah, those are great. And also that you don't have to celebrate the actual holiday on the same day that everybody else celebrates the holiday. I mean, I know some people that decide that their family is going to do Christmas on New Year's Day. Great. If that's what works for your family, that's okay. Go ahead and do that.
Some people decide that Christmas starts after Halloween. They just bypass Thanksgiving already.
That's right.
I would also tell people to take care of themselves, physically, emotionally, get some rest, right? When you can, eat well, take that walk. It does help.
Does. And just like grief affects us physically, then taking care of ourselves physically is a way of taking care of ourselves with our grief.
I had a friend who showed up at my door many times when I didn't want to leave the house. And she just said, "We're just going to go to the end of the road and come right back." And that breath of fresh air was so great.
So one other thing I would say is helpful in getting through the holidays. Many of us in the midst of grief, the holidays happen to us and you don't feel like you have much control. And I think it's important to find a way, even if it's a small way, of remembering and honoring the person that you lost. So for some people, it's to put a little table in a corner with a picture of the person and a candle and a chair by it so people can sit down and think about the person. Maybe it's having if you're still doing a tree and ornament that has some special meaning for that person. You might, if you're going to a family gathering, you might make a favorite food that your loved one loved, and that gives you a chance to speak the person's name. You can say, oh, this was one of Cassidy's favorites. Open up that opportunity to talk. I know when my wife's mother died, when Barbara's mother died, that the first Thanksgiving, when she was here living with us, she had a walker with a seat on it. And she used to come to the table and she had the place at the end and she would turn the walker around and sit there. So for Thanksgiving, we put the walker at the end of the table with her picture there. And that was our way of honoring and remembering her.
Again, doing what's right for you is so important. Those are all great suggestions, and there's lots more out there. But if someone is looking for a grief support group, where can people find help?
Depending on where you are, all the hospice volunteers programs around the country, as you mentioned, and around the world, I hope, have loss groups, grief groups, bereavement groups of some kind. In this area, I only know in detail the hospice volunteers of the Waterville area. They have, at different times, they have a group for grieving parents. They have a group for partner loss. They have a group for survivors of suicide. They have Hope's Place, which is a program for kids from 3, 4, 5 years old up and through teens. And the kids meet together and the parents of the children who have also had losses meet together. One of the things I love about the hospice volunteers in Waterville is they most of the time have had an open group, which means it meets twice a month and you can come whenever you want. A lot of the groups are closed. You meet for usually around 8 weeks, and that's the time period, and then the group repeats again a couple of times a year. But this is just you can come for 2 months, you can take a break, you can come back, and it's nice to have that opportunity as well. There's hospice volunteers of Somerset County. I know they have some support groups. I'm not sure. And there's also the hospice volunteers, I think, of Kennebec Valley that are out of Gardner.
Well, we really appreciate you being here. I really want to thank you for being such a resource to our listeners and for the work you do for grief support in our community. And we didn't share this until now, but I think it's important to share that Mark is also my neighbor and so kindly reached out to me after Cassidy died, not only as a trained grief professional, but as just a caring human being. And you didn't just make that difficult call, because I'm sure it was for you to contact me the first time, but you kept calling me for weeks, months, and now years later, which is amazing. And really, you gave me the greatest gift of providing me with a safe space to share my grief. And you gave me a lot of hope when I didn't know I had any. And my gratitude is just immeasurable. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Of course, you're welcome. My privilege as well. And Colby, I had this memory when I was waiting to sign on. One time I was walking down the street and you were in the front yard with your dog sitting there. And I stopped and talked to you for a few minutes. And I just remember that I wasn't even sure what to say to you, but I was so happy that you were there and thinking, what a comfort that dog must have been to you at that time.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure that was probably Dante, but
Hmm.
he
Yeah.
was too. He really was. Yeah. He he hung on just long enough, I think, to help me sort of get out of my fog and my grief period. And he was very special in that process to me. So yeah, he's definitely I thank his presence eternally because he was a constant and a good friend.
So, in ending, I want to remind grieving families to honor your own feelings and your needs. Take care of yourself. Surround yourself with people who respect your grief journey and want to help you and to say your child's name this holiday season.
As long as you love.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this podcast helpful, please share our link with others and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. I'm Monica Charette, reminding you that you are never alone in your grief. Until next time, we'll be right here with you, holding the light.
As long as you love. As long as you